You'll be aware that the final tranche of the report into the Manchester arena bombing has been released today. We'll get into that in just a sec, but Carol says, Michelle, sorry, it's just not good enough for Manchester victims. When will we ever learn? I've got to say, Carol, I hate to be the burden of bad news, but I worry that we won't learn. We hear this phrase, don't we, lessons learned, all the time across all different areas, and we don't really seem to learn them, do we? But if you're just kind of playing catch-up, wondering what's going on, as I said, the third and final part now has been released today and has found, and I quote, that there was a significant missed opportunity to prevent this attack. The chair of the inquiry, Sir John Saunders, said that there was a realistic possibility that investigators could have stopped the bombing if they had acted on two important pieces of evidence back in 2017. By the way, it also found that the bomber's family held significant responsibility for his extremist beliefs, but we'll come on to that because they were kind of outside the remit and didn't contribute to the inquiry at all. But Martin Daubney, your thoughts on this?
Well, you're right to say that it wasn't the first time. So about 10 years ago, I worked on a case of a man called Junaid Hussain, who was an Islamist hacker who escaped Britain on bail and became a key target in Syria. He ended up being eviscerated by a drone, I would say rot in hell. And he was openly recruiting British Muslims on Facebook, radicalising them online in full plain sight. And we were phoning MI5, we were phoning top cops and saying, look at this. I went to the King's College International Centre for Radicalisation and I spoke to them in person. I said, what are you doing about this guy? And the answer was nothing. And now we see history.
Really? So
yes.
You went and they said, you said what we're doing, they said nothing.
Well, he was on their radar, but tough. He escaped bail, left the country and became a significant part of the Islamic State. And he wanted to eradicate our way of life. The same with Abadi. Now, we're not talking about a guy here who sent a few malicious tweets. He actively participated in a war in Libya in 2011. He photographed himself with a giant submachine gun taken from a jeep. And he came from a family, a background of terrorists, had a deep hatred of our way of life. This isn't some guy who was just being nasty on Facebook. And then he was downloading recipes of how to make bombs, and he could have been intercepted. Now, as for could prevent have prevented this? I would say the Shawcross report recently showed that the prevent mechanism is completely unfit for purpose. People are slipping through the cracks. There's a terror, I believe, of being called racist or Islamophobic through who we pursue. And that's how people like this get through the net. It's a disgrace. And
I want to come back to that point in a minute. But for now, Aaron, where do you stand on this report out today?
Well, Martin makes a very convincing case, but I think the biggest story here is that in the case of Salman Abedi, MI5 and MI6 were acting at odds with one another. MI5's job is domestically to keep us safe. MI6 is about external affairs. It's the James Bond spy agency. And what we know in 2016, 17 and many years before that is that control orders on terror suspects precisely like Salman Abedi were lifted. They were allowed to travel with impunity, without any restrictions, to war zones like Libya and Syria. Why? Because it suited the foreign or the perceived foreign policy interests of this country. MI6 said, well, we don't like Bashar al-Assad, we don't like Gaddafi, send as many extremists and radicals as you like. Now, that may have helped to overthrow those two men, but it certainly wasn't keeping people in this country safe. And that, to me, is a big story, which this third part of the report doesn't really discuss. MI5, yes, of course, they failed to do their job, absolutely, but why on earth is MI6 allowing people, young men like Abedi, 16, to fight in Libya and then come back and behave like nothing has happened at all? I find it extraordinary.
So what do you reckon should have happened? What, he should have been kept in Libya or what?
Well, I think there should have been a control order. I don't think people should have been allowed to travel to Libya, particularly 16-year-old boys. And I think clearly there's been, and I think this is probably what has happened, is there was an absence of meaningful conversation between MI5 and MI6 about precisely who they should be keeping tabs on. MI6 clearly have a list of people who are highly dangerous because they literally allowed them to travel into these war zones. So we're hearing a lot about MI5 today. I think we should also be hearing something about MI6. We're not, because I think actually that will anger people even more.
But that makes no sense to me. You think that we're not hearing about it because we don't want to overly infuriate and upset people. Surely, you've just seen the whole kind of Shamima Begum. I'm not saying it's the same, but it's similar in ways. Surely, though, that is in the public interest to be out. I think it was outside of the scope of this inquiry, perhaps, which is why we don't have the level of detail that you're perhaps suggesting that we should. But what do you think should happen then? Another inquiry into that component, or what?
Peter Oborne wrote a great piece, Conservative, wrote a great piece about this in the Mail in 2017. And he said that MI5 does their best to keep us safe. It's failed in this instance, of course. And he said that MI6, with this interventionist policy of allowing extremists to travel abroad just because they're fighting people we don't particularly like, are actually endangering the safety of people in this country. That's what he said. So I think there clearly needs to be a rethink with regards to MI6. My point here is just generally, it's far more complicated than what we're hearing right now. It isn't just MI5 were asleep at the wheel. MI6 have a policy, which some people would argue, me included, means that people in this country are made less safe, not more.
Let's pick up on this political correctness point that you just raised, Martin, because I do think it is an interesting and important one. And I think it was in the first part of the report, because obviously 3 parts. The first part, one of the things that came out was that this fellow was kind of loitering around with his backpack. He looked, out of place. And the guys didn't dare radio through and kind of flag this because he didn't want to be regarded as a potential racist and all the rest of it. How much of a part do you think all of that played in the goings-on here?
I think it plays a significant part, and it also did in the Rotherham grooming gang scandal, also did in the Junaid Hussain case I mentioned. And the facts are the facts. When we look at terror deaths and terror arrests on British soil, the overriding majority are of Muslim men. Now, that's not to say that all Muslim men do that, of course not. But 56% of all terror arrests are Muslim men versus 6.5% of the population. Those are just the facts. Now, if we can just see through the perceptions of racism and Islamophobia and deal with the truth, we might get somewhere. Unfortunately, we can't. And back to Aaron's point of MI6 allowing people to kind of wander out of the country to fight wars, that goes contra to what Junaid Hussain did. He jumped bail. He first went to Turkey, then went over the border. Same with Shamima Begum. And I think you're right to bring that case up, because isn't it funny how we're saying that we shouldn't be allowing people back from war zones into the UK because there's much higher risk of them committing terror atrocities? Of course there is. It stands to reason. They fought in an arena of war alongside Islamic State. Yet we are saying Shamima Begum, particularly from the Liberal left, should be allowed to come back. And I think we have to have a no-holds-barred conversation about the realities of the risks versus this fear of being called racist.
And that's fair, isn't it, Aaron?
Well, I would say Shamima Begum should stand trial. She should face British justice, just like the Nazis did after the Second World War.
She might get away with it, though, because...
Separate point. I mean, and I think that's a valid point. I don't dispute that. But my view is you've committed a crime, you should face a court and British justice. Just my view. Mm-hmm. And I think the same should have happened with Abedi. The point is, MI6 was allowing people like him to travel freely in and out of the country. He should have been arrested the minute he was back in this country, because he was aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation overseas.
Agree.
And yet, actually, he's part of the plan. While you're fighting Bashar al-Assad, fine. Well, we'll give you a free pass. Not good enough.
And what do you think about this whole political, the political correct, not wanting to call things out and all the rest of it for fear of being called racist? Do you think that's contributed to the situation?
I don't know. I don't know what's going on in these gentlemen's heads. Look, they're security guards at a major event in 2017. This kind of attack has happened before. It stands to reason you should do your job and probably stop the guy entering if he's got a massive backpack on. I find it somewhat surreal that this did happen. I think many of your viewers have probably seen video footage of it. It looks strange that he managed to even enter the building. So, yes, there's clearly many failures here. I don't know what was going on in their heads, whether or not they were worried about being called racists. Frankly, if somebody's white, brown or black, if they're walking around with a giant backpack in an area like that, I think... In a
child's concert.
You should have a word with them, yeah.
I absolutely think that there is this situation where people are frightened to get involved because they don't want to be called names. And it harps back, for me, I think 2016, again in Manchester, the Trafford Centre. It's always stuck in my head as this. They did a rehearsal, an overnight rehearsal in the Trafford Centre to preempt a terror attack and make sure that everyone knew what they were doing, rehearse their response to it. And at the start of the role play that they were doing, basically, was that someone went into the shopping centre and blew himself up. So at the start of this role play, they shouted the phrase Allah Akbar. And it was, they were hugely criticised for it. And people then came out, so I've got some of the quotes here. So the Assistant Chief Constable at the time came out and said an apology. We apologise for the offence that's been caused. The Greater Manchester Police Crime Commissioner came out as well and said it was ill-judged and unnecessary and unacceptable decision for those to be playing the part of terrorists to have shouted that phrase before setting off their fake bombs. Well, I would say it wasn't unnecessary and ill-judged and all the rest of it. It was actually a probability that would have been the threat that they faced at the time and therefore an essential part of their role play, but yet they end up apologising for it.
Well, you're clearly trying to model a situation which you want to prevent, right? And so I personally have no issue with it. Maybe I'm a bad leftist. I mean, I personally have no issue with it. If you were trying to model a far-right terrorist, you'd do something similar, right? You would have something like what Thomas Mayer said when he killed Joe Cox. So simulating what you're trying to prevent seems a very fair and reasonable thing to do. If they came in for criticism for that, I think that's unreasonable.
And when you look at the latest data, the Terrorism in Great Britain House of Commons Library report from last year showed of 93 terror deaths in Britain on British soil 2003 till 21. 93 total, only 2 were put down to the far right, and even then, one of them was just not associated with anybody else. The vast majority of deaths on British soil have been caused by Islamist terrorists. This is the reality. And to put it through a filter of being afraid to apprehend in case it offends is actually part of the problem.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't help. As I said, I'll always keep harping back to that example in 2016 because I just think you absolute pillocks. You know, why would you apologise for something that was quite realistic and an essential part of what it is that you were trying to do? And when you come out and you do these ridiculous apologies, then you actually enable these kind of things to keep going on because then people think, oh, well, I better not say and do that because it is wrong. Rachel says this inquiry will not solve anything. You're saying one of the challenges is people just simply do not want to offend others. Patricia says, Michelle, why does everyone expect these people to be able to catch everybody? It's such a shame in this country that we have a blame game. These people have stopped so many attacks. They are brave men and women who work quietly in the shadows to keep us all safe. She thinks that they deserve praise, not criticism. What's your thoughts on that? Get in touch. GBviews@gbnews.uk is my email address.